Hi, this is Andy Yen from Proton, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, as always, Kerry Parker, and we have episode 269 for April 25th, 2022. And today, as I'm sure you have figured out, we are going to be talking with the CEO of Proton, best known for probably Proton Mail, Andy Yen. And he has been on the show before. It turns out it's been quite some time. I had to go back and look. It was late 2017 since I actually had him on as a guest. I've had him on twice before. Now, he did contribute a nice snippet for my 200th podcast episode, but really haven't had him on as a guest for quite some time. I'm really glad to have him back. He's a really great guy. You know, I don't do infomercials, but I really like Proton. They've done some great stuff. I've been a Proton Mail user for many, many years. And I really think that they have struck the right balance. They've got a really nice service that is very easy to use, very intuitive, and they keep adding more and more features all the time. It's really great. So anyway, again, sorry to make this sound like an infomercial, but I really like what they're doing. And we're going to talk today, of course, about privacy and the importance in the modern world, especially given, again, I hate to, keep bringing this up, but the Ukraine war with Russia should be making us all think very carefully about how important things like privacy and security are in our daily lives. And in situations like that, privacy becomes real. I mean, like life or death real. And as we'll talk about also with Andy, it's important using services like a VPN, and of course Proton makes one of those too, to be able to get access to information when your repressive government is trying to prevent you from doing that. So anyway, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some real life scenarios. There was a particular case that we're going to talk about today that I specifically wanted Andy to address because it hit the news not that long ago. It was a case where Proton was legally required to give up information about one of their users. And this kind of caused a kerfuffle on the internet. And I wanted to get into that, and I wanted to give him a chance to talk to about it. And I think it's important to discuss it as a true real-life case. It's one thing to talk about things kind of in the abstract or from an ivory tower perspective, but to actually talk about a specific case where this became a real issue. And I wanted to have him kind of explain how all this works. And he makes the point, rightly so, that every company, no matter where you are subject to rules. And unless you happen to be somehow on a country of your own or stationed on a boat at international waters, you've got to comply with local laws. And they are in Switzerland, which, by the way, has some of the best privacy laws on the planet. But even they, in certain circumstances, for law enforcement reasons, when duly served with the proper paperwork, are compelled to give up certain amounts of information. And what we're going to find is they really didn't have much to give, which is what you want. They have engineered themselves out of the problem by having true encryption that is controlled by you, the user, so that there's really nothing that they can give up. But we'll get into all the details of this with Andy. Now, one more fun little twist to all this, and you'll have to stay tuned after the interview for the details, is I want you guys to give Proton Mail a try. And again, this is not an infomercial, but I would like you guys to give it a shot too. They've got a perfectly good free tier to start with that you can check out. But I've also got some free codes to give away that will give you a free upgrade to their Plus account. These codes were something I was actually working to try to get into the last promotion, and for various reasons, including some fault of my own, they didn't make it into that promotion, but that means that I have them left over now to use here, and I thought this would be a great time to do that. And anyway, I'm going to be giving those away, and the details of that will be after the interview. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get to the interview with Dr. Andy Yen of Proton. Andy is the founder and CEO of Proton. He was a scientist at CERN, has a PhD in physics from Harvard University, and he has long worked to advance privacy and freedom online. Welcome back to the show, Andy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Can't believe it's been over 4 years since you were last on the podcast. I think at that point, you just released maybe Proton VPN back about that time. And I think changed your name from Proton Mail to Proton. It's now just Proton. Maybe if you would, give us a quick overview of Proton and maybe catch us up on what's changed with you guys since we last spoke.
Yeah, I don't actually think it's been 4 years, but time goes by pretty quickly, so it's entirely possible. So you may be right. Yeah, but I think things are changing a lot. Things are constantly moving, right? We're in a space that is rapidly evolving. The demand for privacy, security online is in constant flux. What we have seen quite consistently in the past couple of years is more and more need for the products that we build, both the mail product and also the VPN product. The VPN product in particular is something that has taken off more than we anticipated. And it's an exciting time to be in the space. Quite a lot has happened as a team, as a company. We are evolving. We're trying to grow. We're trying to develop faster, and really to stay true to the mission and deliver more products to more users around the world.
All right, so as we both know, there's no such thing as perfect security or privacy, and also everyone's situation is different. We not only have different threat models, but we all have a different tolerance levels for the inevitable inconveniences that come with increasing your security and privacy. So how do you recommend that people figure out, what their personal threat model is? And how do you advise people to find that right balance between security and convenience?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think actually most people probably don't have the level of education and knowledge really to completely understand, in fact, their personal threat models, right? And that's actually the biggest problem because you can't know what you don't know, and you can't defend against what you don't know, right? So really a big challenge for all companies in the privacy and security space is education. Right? I think first we need to help people understand what they should think about. And if I go around and ask people, right, most of them don't even understand what is a concept of threat model. So education is the first thing, right? You can't really protect yourselves against threats that you don't even know about. And there's no substitute for taking the time to learn and understand what those threats are in the first place.
When you think of threat model, you think, maybe I'm a journalist or a dissident or something, but everyone has a threat model. I mean, you could be, mom and pop have a threat model. If you're an employee, that's one threat model versus the employer, which is a different threat model. You might be a famous person or a dissident, but I mean, everyone has a different thing. So I guess what I'm looking for is how would you, if you're talking to a neighbor at a cocktail party or something like that, and how would you explain to them how they need to think about and what things they need to consider when they're determining how secure or private they need to be?
I believe for a kind of general audience, if you go into the technology, at that point, you kind of lost them, right? I know your audience and your listeners are a bit more tech savvy, but for the average consumer, you can't really go into that level of detail, right? You cannot explain to them that, hey, you need to use end-to-end encryption because they say, what is end-to-end encryption? And they don't even know what it is, right? And then they might see, a business that advertises end-to-end encryption, but isn't actually end-to-end encrypted, right? Zoom was a famous example of that, right? It's not really knowing the terminology. It's not even really knowing the technology as well, because it's really impossible for them, for the average person to understand that. So what I suggest is really to make sure that they focus on, what a business is about. Right. So take, for example, let's say Google or even Facebook, right? What you know and what is very clear to most people without even a tech understanding is that Google and Facebook's business model is not really aligned to your interest as a consumer, right? When you use a Google product, you're not Google's actual user or customer. In fact, you're the product that they're selling to their real customers, which are the advertisers. And what this really tells you is it doesn't really matter what type of technology Google is claiming. It doesn't really matter what type of privacy policy Google is claiming that it has, right? It doesn't really matter how they try to obfuscate the issue. At the end of the day, they probably are not really going to have your best interests at heart. And if you really care about your data security and having control over your data in your digital life, then Google and Facebook, just due to the nature of their business value, of the business model and the values of the business, is not going to be that provider. And then you probably know you got to go somewhere else. And where else do you go? Well, you should look for the company that has a compatible business model, because at the end of the day, all these companies are businesses, right? And how they make money really dictates how they're going to protect your information.
Because there's such a multidimensional spectrum when you come to privacy and security levels for people, it's obvious that no one product is right for all people. So how do you approach this problem when you design Proton's various offerings? Like who is your target market, if there is just one? And is there a particular maybe an audience or threat model that you consciously don't address?
Well, I think for Proton to succeed, we have to get to the world where everybody and anybody can use a Proton product, right? Mm-hmm. And this is because we believe fundamentally privacy and security are fundamental human rights. Mm. And if it's fundamental human rights, then it must be available to everybody, no matter whether they can pay or not, doesn't matter where they live, doesn't matter their level of technical sophistication, right? So, for that reason, we really design our products to be, accessible to a mainstream audience, but at the same time, not compromising, on the core technology, right? On the core promises of security and privacy. There is, as you say, of course, a spectrum, right? I could build you probably the most secure service in the world, but it would probably be so hard to use that no one would be ever able to use it, right? Which means that it would add no value to society. So security and privacy fundamentally is about making compromises, right? And every company is going to have to make a compromise at some level. There's no way to avoid it. So the best that you can do in this situation is to make sure that you clearly document your compromises, right? And Proton has a very clearly outlined threat model for each of our products that makes it clear what we do and do not protect against, right? But in terms of the baseline end-to-end encryption, that is mathematics, right? There's no compromise there. But of course, there will be compromises, both in terms of the user interface and other elements, right? An example of a compromise that we have to make is because in email, we store all data in a encrypted format. That obviously creates a problem for searching because when you want to do a search on encrypted data and your server doesn't access that data, that search has to be done on the client side, right? So we do support a search now, but it took us a lot longer to build that search capability. It's available on the web. You can actually search encrypted data on the web client, but that was not something that we could support out of the box. What I would also say is as time goes on, technology gets better, right? The mobile devices that we use today are way more advanced than they were even 3-4 years ago because of Moore's law, right?
Yeah.
And that means that many of the things that in the past were not possible to do in a privacy protected way, today actually are possible just because mobile devices and browsers have gotten so much better. So, there are compromises, but slowly but surely we are closing that gap. And the end goal should be in, let's say 3-4 years from now, if somebody were to ask you, okay, I like Proton Mail, I want to get more privacy, more security, but what do I have to give up in exchange for that? Well, ideally we want to get to the place where the answer to that is nothing. You give nothing up and you also get, the privacy and security.
Yeah. So true. VPNs are commonly touted as a privacy panacea. I mean, private's right in the name, right? So, but the reality is that there's a lot of nuance when you're choosing and using a VPN. So what sorts of problems can VPNs solve for people? And maybe what are the most common misconceptions about VPNs?
Yeah, this is an area where there's a lot of misinformation. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the VPN providers out there, I'm not going to name names, probably have less than ethical business practices where they're trying to sell VPN to basically everybody, right? Even for use cases where it's not correct. I think there was even a case of one famous VPN that I'll say because everybody knows it. I think that NordVPN got in trouble in the UK or running some advertisements that were in the end false or misleading, right? Yeah. And so I think obviously we need to be very careful because the last thing you want to do is sell to somebody a product that doesn't protect them against what they actually need protection for, right? And so communication is very important. Some people think that if you use a VPN, you're not going to get a virus. It's going to protect you from phishing, all these different things, right? But it's not true, right? A VPN does nothing against phishing, right? This is what I've seen, right? A VPN maybe does protect you slightly against getting a virus in your computer, but that's very marginal, right? So I think those are just kind of two very common examples, right? Obviously a VPN doesn't prevent you from getting hacked, right? What does it mean when you say get hacked? Well, getting hacked can mean a dozen different things, right? But, if you make a blanket statement that VPN protects you from hackers, well, that doesn't mean anything, right? But yet that statement needs to be made. Yeah, it's an area where I think readers do need to, and listeners need to educate themselves properly.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, in my social media circles, I see a lot of hot debates about security and privacy products. The most heated arguments always seem to center around anonymity and metadata, particularly when it comes to law enforcement and governmental surveillance. Diehard privacy enthusiasts each have their own, litmus test, like, does this service reside in a Five Eyes country? Or can I pay for this product using cryptocurrency? Or does this company log my IP address? Or is this software 100% open source? First of all, are these the right questions to ask? And second, what do you feel is the proper balance between the human right to privacy, which we've talked about, and, basic societal needs for law enforcement?
Well, I think all those questions you mentioned are important and relevant questions, right? And depending on your threat model, could even be, the most pertinent questions for you to ask. So I really think that people should ask questions because if you ask questions, actually nothing bad comes out of that, right? I think the worst case is you just come out of that losing a bit of time, but becoming more knowledgeable, right? So I definitely encourage questions to be asked. And I also think that, companies should be prepared to answer those questions and be transparent wherever possible, right? So nothing against questions. I think those are, all good questions. In terms of balance between privacy and the needs of law enforcement, this is probably an endless topic that has been there since the beginning of time and will probably still be there long after we're gone, right? There's no black and white answer here because it's not a black and white issue. It's actually it's a pretty gray issue with quite a bit of nuances.
Oh, yeah.
And we could speak about this probably for hours or weeks, right? And there have been people debating this in both the US and also in the EU that have been debating this for years now. And they still don't have a solution because there is no, one correct solution. What I can really, so I can't tell, so I can tell you the silver bullet, right? Because the exact answer also depends on your own set of personal values, right? But I can tell you the way that I think about the problem and the way that I think, lawmakers and society should think about this problem, right? We know it's not an absolute, it's not black and white. There has to be, a middle ground that we need to achieve. And in establishing that middle ground, it's really important to look at overall benefit to society that technology brings. So I'll give you an example of that. An example would be airplanes. We've learned, unfortunately, during 9/11, that terrorists can use airplanes. And they can use airplanes to great effect, right? Yeah. But does that mean we ban airplanes? Actually, no. We don't ban airplanes because without airplanes, a lot of benefits to society that airplanes bring, doesn't exist, right? So that's kind of what I mean by balance, right? You can't ban everything terrorists use because then, there'd be nothing left in society, right?
Right.
And this is kind of, so the way to look at this, to decide what you ban and what you don't ban is to look at the overall social benefits of, something, right? And, there's many technologies where if there's a strong social benefit, then we need to accept some of the negative externalities because the benefits outweigh the disadvantages.
So as a CEO of a company that is all about privacy, and I'd like to get your perspective, like specifically, like for instance, Apple has gone to great lengths to, tout themselves as a privacy-oriented company. And, to their credit, they have tried from an engineering standpoint, from a technical standpoint, to actually kind of engineer themselves out of the equation, like try to get themselves to the point where they can't provide data because they don't collect it, or it is end-to-end encrypted, so they literally have zero access to it. And, kind of remove themselves from the equation through it from an engineering standpoint by minimizing data collection and minimizing what they can actually get to. As a CEO of a company like this, do you share that view? Like, how do you approach the idea of, privacy from an engineering standpoint?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say that Apple is kind of the golden standard when it comes to privacy. Right?
Sure.
Because we really have to kind of, understand what does Apple mean by privacy when they say, we stand for privacy. And if we were to look very closely at it, when Apple says, we protect your privacy and we value privacy, what Apple is really saying is we want to make sure your data is private from everybody except for us, right? And that last bit is quite important because when we talk about what privacy actually means, is no ifs or buts or exceptions, right? What privacy means is your data is private, period, right? The difference, I think, between Apple and big tech's definition of privacy and the Proton's definition of privacy is that thing, right? So, we believe in privacy, period. Private also from us at all levels. And the way that you build your product, the way that you build your technology is completely different, when you take that other approach, right? Apple actually has a huge amount of data on their users, and they leverage that data quite effectively in fact, doing advertising. It's more subtle, but Apple for sure is involved in advertising.
Yep.
Whereas, at Proton, we built our technology in such a way that even if we wanted to advertise, we couldn't. So we have no advertising business because even if we wanted to do it, the data simply doesn't exist, right? And this is kind of the privacy by default or privacy by design, way of engineering that is quite different, and in many ways also quite a bit more difficult.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, all right. So I want to bring up this one recent case where Proton was served with a request by international law enforcement for evidence in an investigation. They were looking for an IP address logs for a French climate activist. And I know that Proton has spent a lot of time addressing this in the tech press and the social media. I've seen that. But I'm guessing most of my audience probably knows little or nothing about this incident. But I think it would be kind of instructive to break down a specific real world case of privacy versus legal compliance. So could you tell us what happened, what they asked for, what you had, what your legal requirements were, and then maybe, what did Proton learn from all this and how might it affect how you do things going forward?
Sure. Yeah, I think the crux of the issue here is that these people, they might have been, climate activists, but they also probably weren't climate activists. And what I mean by that is they were, engaged in breaking and entering private property and causing large amounts of property damage. And that, unfortunately, in most countries, including Switzerland, is a felony, right?
Sure.
That's a criminal act. And it doesn't really matter, what company you're talking about, right? Unless your company is based on a boat or an island, floating offshore in international waters in unclaimed territory, you are going to be under the jurisdiction of, some country.
Right. Yeah.
And Proton is under Swiss jurisdiction, right? And, there is no company in the world where using the services of that company means that you are offered immunity from criminal prosecution. That simply doesn't exist, right?
Right.
So, in this case, obviously, Proton doesn't give you immunity from criminal prosecution in Switzerland. If you commit a felony, the police can, in fact, go after you. And in this case, they requested an IP address from the specific user. And the way the internet works, it's TCP/IP connections, right? Every internet service you connect to is going to be able to see an IP address because that is the way the internet is designed. That's the way the technology works, right? And this is kind of the endless debate between anonymity and privacy. Right? What Proton Mail provides is privacy. It doesn't provide anonymity because it can't provide anonymity because it is not possible for IP addresses to not exist on the internet, right? And this, I think, goes back to OPSEC, right? If these people had taken better measures, if they had used, let's say, a VPN or a Tor to hide their IP address, then there would be no IP address for law enforcement to collect, right? Or actually, they would get an IP address, but it wouldn't be their IP address.
Right.
I think what the case demonstrated was also quite interesting because everybody focuses on the IP address, right? But that's in many ways actually missing the point because the police were not after the IP addresses of these people, right? These folks had been previously arrested. They were squatting the property that they had illegally broken into and entered. So the nature of squatting is that the police obviously knows where you're located, right? Because you are illegally squatting on a property. So what the law enforcement was looking for in this case wasn't actually to find or identify them. They knew where they were, right? The complaint had been called in. What the law enforcement was trying to get in this case was actually access to the emails that they were exchanging to build a case against them. And in that regard, actually their usage of Proton Mail, instead of getting them in trouble, actually probably saved them because our zero access encryption does work. And this was proven, in a legal case where, even under a criminal, summons in a criminal case in Switzerland, we were not able to hand over any email content. So that proves actually that it works. And the fact that we couldn't hand over the email content probably prevented a more serious case being built against these individuals. So, I know a lot of focus on the IP case, but I think, the kind of the moral here is that actually it does work, as it's supposed to, and it works quite well.
I'm not sure why this particular case got so much attention, but I mean, in reading some of your responses to this, like one of the things I saw that I thought was fascinating was you said you actually fought over 700 cases in 2020 alone for people. So it's not like it's not like you're not fighting for your users. And maybe it's one of those situations like it's all the things you don't hear about, which are maybe more important. But the other thing I thought was interesting is you said there were no less than 3 different authorities in 2 different countries that required that request. It's complicated, all this law stuff.
Yes. It's not like, you come knocking and you can easily get the data, right? It has to be a criminal case. It has to meet the criminal standard in Switzerland. We can argue whether the checks or balances are strong enough, but there are checks and balances. And I think the law is the law, right? There's no company that, as I said, unless you're based in a boat in the ocean, you'll be under a law of a country. And Switzerland is, no country is perfect, right? I'm not going to say that Switzerland privacy laws are perfect either, but I think compared to many other countries, it does do, as of right now, a pretty good job of defending, privacy rights. But at the same time, defending privacy rights in Switzerland doesn't mean immunity for criminals. And this is, I think, this is maybe a detail that people didn't realize, right? And in fact, you mentioned our transparency report where we mentioned that we fought 700 cases. And so I was kind of surprised that this thing was so surprising to people because the transparency report has been published since 2015, right? So, you could see actually the history and on all the cases have been documented there for years. We fight wherever we can. And one of the things that maybe you saw was that actually last year around October, we actually won a court case, right? Which increased the privacy of email providers in Switzerland. So we definitely are fighting. And we even take the government to court quite often on these cases. And, we also win from time to time as well. So it's definitely not a case where, we're not fighting for our users.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thanks for explaining that. I think that was important to talk about that. There are a lot of nuances to this, and it's not black and white. And I think it's important to understand and certainly get it straight from you guys, how these things work and what the law really means and how it operates and how technologically you have, made a point of, engineering yourself out of this because you can't get to that stuff. I think that's important to call out. One more question about this, and I'll kind of take it from a slightly different angle. Many democratic governments have argued that modern privacy technologies like yours are preventing law enforcement and intelligence agencies from protecting their citizens. They say they whether they want backdoors or privileged access, basically saying that we're going dark, and that they can't do their jobs if people are allowed to have true, things like true end-to-end encryption. If you had the chance to bend these guys' ears, if you could, sit down in maybe a private scenario where you could advise lawmakers and appointed people at these agencies, how would you recommend that they approach this? How are they getting it wrong? How are they not thinking about this stuff properly?
Well, I think they're missing a lot of the nuance here, right? And what I would tell them is, look, there's no doubt that a society without privacy is going to be more, quote unquote, secure, right? But this society does exist, right? It's called China, North Korea, and I guess Russia today, right?
Yep.
And if you were living there, would you actually feel more secure, right? And the answer would probably be no, right? You would feel that your government is completely surveying you, and then you take a wrong step, you end up in jail. It's a different type of insecurity that comes from a total surveillance society. So this is why we have to understand what we mean when we say security, right? I think security has many aspects, and terrorists killing your children is one aspect, and that's very flashy and very good for winning political campaigns. But we also need to think about, security from the standpoint of, am I able to have freedom of expression? Am I able to, have freedom of speech? Because these are actually the tenets that make our democracy possible, right? And if we don't protect those, then in fact we have, a lot more at stake than, just the safety of our children, right? So, this is why you have to consider the whole picture as well. And it's very easy to take a very simplistic view on this, but I think if the lawmakers just focus on that aspect, they're somehow missing the bigger picture.
What are the things that these guys bring up? They've tried to find technological solutions to this that aren't the typical backdoor. Like, for instance, one of the ones I've heard is, and in a way, actually, this is something that Apple's iMessage while it is end-to-end encrypted, Apple holds the keys to that. And they also set up the sessions. For example, one security researcher I heard said, well, one thing that Apple could do is they could, because let me divert just briefly for a second. The way that iMessage works is if you had a group chat, my understanding is each one of the connections between the end people in the chat are individually encrypted between them. But what you could do, for example, is you could add to any point-to-point chat, you could add another person, and that person would be like a wiretap. And that wouldn't be breaking encryption. It would just be kind of breaking the process. So I'm curious, of all the technological solutions that have been thrown around, obviously, I mean, I think all of us can agree at this point that backdoors are not the way to go. You can't weaken encryption. But do you think that there is a technological solution of any sort that would strike the right balance between having true end-to-end encryption and yet still allowing some form of like a wiretap or some other way to break into communications?
It's a tough question, right? It's something that governments have been grappling with. What I think is good to see is in the past couple of years, the outright calls for banning encryption or end-to-end encryption have kind of subsided. I think many governments, I hope, are beginning to better realize that those proposals are untenable because they weaken security in such fundamental ways that there will be massive problems if they were to be carried out, right? Mm-hmm. But the challenge here is these proposals are so technology specific, right? So what you describe with iMessage, that's only possible because of the way that iMessage works, mm-hmm. right? You can have a different chat service that we maybe design in a more secure and more private way where that wouldn't be possible, right? So it's extremely difficult to say, hey, this is one solution that we should adopt universally, and this is the correct way to find the right balance. I don't think there is a silver bullet like that, right? I think what there needs to be is probably a continual discussion between governments, tech companies, and also civil society groups to kind of iterate and find a consensus, right? And this consensus, I think, doesn't really exist yet, right? Governments still take relatively extreme positions, but we need to have these conversations so the consensus is ever going to be built, right? And what I often see is governments with these proposals, they're not consulting tech companies, they're not consulting private companies, they're not consulting civil society, they're just doing it on their own. And then you wonder why we can't reach a consensus, right?
Right. All right, one more kind of question around this specifically, since there is this right now with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, privacy in general and encrypted communications specifically have life or death consequences potentially. And just because you trust your current government doesn't mean that it can't radically change in short order, I think is another lesson to be drawn from what's going on right now. But I'm just curious, before we wrap up, are there any other lessons you think we should take from this situation that's going on right now? It's all nice to talk about this from an ivory tower perspective or academically, in the abstract, but when it really happens, I think it brings home for people how real these things are and how important these things are. So are there any other lessons you think we might draw from what's going on right now, specifically from this situation? And maybe do you have any specific advice for communicating securely and privately when the consequences for failure are potentially dire?
Yes, this is an area that, of course, we're very actively involved in these days. What we see, of course, in Russia is the enforcement of large-scale mass censorship, really on a scale that hasn't been seen since the Soviet era, right? In fact, because of the prevalence of digital tools, I would say the censorship is even stronger than it was back in the 80s, right? And we do see, in fact, a more than tenfold increase in VPN usage, in Proton VPN usage in Russia, because today a VPN is not just the only way to stay private, but also the only way to learn the truth. And I think truth is extremely important because wars are not just won on the ground, right? They're also information wars that need to be won as well. And I'm glad that we're able to assist in ensuring the free flow of information in places like Russia and also in Ukraine as well, right?
Yeah,
which is,
sure.
I think that's suffering terribly. And the independent press and journalists is also extremely important, and we're very happy to be able to provide actually at this point, hundreds of accounts, free accounts to journalists reporting from a conflict zone and be able to support in that way. What I find that is very interesting and can I share here is what a lot of tech companies are grappling with is do we stay in Russia? Do we pull out of Russia? Right? Companies, of course, want to pull out because there's two reasons for pulling out, right? I think the reason most tech companies are pulling out is because they cannot collect money anymore. They cannot take payments from Russians. So you're going to lose money in that market, right? So a lot of them are leaving for that reason. But I think the other kind of, reason for companies leaving and the reason that people are, pressuring companies to leave is because in some ways you want the ordinary people to feel that there's an impact, there's a consequence to the government's actions and maybe to push for change in government policy, right? Because in a country like Russia, which is nuclear power, change probably has to come from within, right? But at the same time, if we completely disconnect, let's say, Russia from the internet and Russians from Western internet services, you're also in some ways doing the government's work for them, right? The government would like nothing more than to have all of its citizens on platforms that it controls, right? So this is, I think, where again you get the kind of right balance. So in Proton's case, because we're so essential for ensuring the safe of information, and because we also want to be able to assist in this situation, we've actually chosen to stay in the market, right? And keep providing services for users in Russia. And for some, this is a controversial stance, right? But I'm happy that when we announced this, we actually got almost entirely support from the Proton user community, and I'm glad that we're able to do this. But this is one of the very interesting things that I found out of this conflict is this is also another area where striking the right balance is extremely important.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There is sort of this knee-jerk cancel culture thing sometimes that I think that we get wrapped up in. It's just so easy to virtue signal by, I have nothing to do with Russia. But I think you made completely the right call, and I'm glad you guys are staying involved there. Last question, and let's maybe end on a hopeful note. What does the future look like for Proton? Can you tell us, what new features or services you're working on? And maybe, what other privacy or security problems would you still like to solve?
Well, I think we have plenty of work on our existing products, right? I think just Proton Mail, Proton VPN, there are tons of things that we need to improve, and many people are, constantly asking for new features. So that will be an ongoing body of work. We have the calendar and drive product that are rolling out this year more widely, and we plan to get that into general availability for all users. So I think that'll be very exciting because for the first time, you'll be able to have a complete suite of products that works well together, right? I think email today doesn't exist in isolation. Email usually exists with calendar and also with file storage. So we're glad to be able to build not just a privacy product, but also a privacy ecosystem. A big focus this year and coming years is actually going to be continuing to make Proton more user-friendly, right, and more accessible. Because we don't want just you to use it. We want it to be so easy to use that your parents or even your grandparents can use it, because that is what is necessary for our mission to actually succeed. And I think in order to do that, we will also be probably updating the way that we message and even the visuals of the products themselves, because we need to make it more approachable, right? I think the biggest challenge in the industry is how do you make privacy approachable, and that is probably what the future of Proton is, because if we don't make privacy more approachable, then we don't actually get it out there to everybody.
Absolutely. And so, I always encourage people that want to see more privacy to, kind of put their money where their mouth is and support these things. So one of the ways they could do that is by using products like yours and paying for products like yours. Is there anything else that you recommend people do if they want to see more privacy in their world, if they want to have a better tomorrow? What do you recommend people do to get more involved or to, kind of manifest that future?
Well, there is one thing that you can do, and it's probably not something that will be immediately obvious, right? Right now, the reason we don't have privacy is actually because we don't have competition in the tech space, right? Google and Facebook have no incentive to be more private because the consequences of not being private is nothing, right? Where else are you going to go, right? If you don't want to go, if you don't like Instagram's privacy policy, what is your alternative? And the answer is nothing, right? And what I find, very interesting, both in Europe and also in the US, is members of Congress in the U.S. are beginning to pay attention, right? There is now legislation, and I want to stress it's bipartisan legislation, which means it's supported by both the Democrats and the Republicans, which is advancing in both the House and also the Senate, which is taking aim at big tech monopolies. And this legislation, if passed, can really make the internet much more competitive. And that is actually what will compel tech companies, larger and smaller, to begin to put users' interests first. And this is probably going to lead to the adoption of more privacy technologies, and also allow smaller privacy companies, like Proton and other companies out there who are trying to fight the good fight, to be able to compete on an even footing with big tech. So I think it's important to support this legislation, and also let your elected representatives know that this legislation is important. And because if they hear that this is something that their constituents want, then this change can actually happen. And I think there's a very, very good chance that we can get this legislation passed because it is bipartisan in nature. And I think that's something that's very hopeful. And I encourage everybody to look into this and pay attention to this because it's happening now. And there is actually a very good chance that something could be done here, despite all the gridlock in the DC.
Well, that is a hopeful way to end this. Thank you so much, Andy, for coming on the show and expressing your opinions.
Yes, thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to being back sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Big thanks again to Andy for coming on the show and for coming on in general. I mean, CEO of a company like Proton Mail is, it's really nice that he took the time out to come and talk to, let's face it, not a huge podcast like mine, but I'm so glad to be able to bring that perspective from somebody at that level who truly obviously cares about privacy and founded his whole company based on those principles, and bring that to you guys so you can hear directly from him how he thinks about privacy and how he created his company and tailored his products to meet those goals. And I really think it's important for us to understand that there are compromises to be made. First of all, there is no such thing as 100% secure or 100% private. It's impossible. As the famous quote goes, 3 men could keep a secret as long as 2 of them are dead. And I'm not even sure that would guarantee it, right? People make mistakes. But I think Proton really has the right balance, and it is an extremely secure and private email service. So your messages, the content of your messages are secure as long as you're communicating between 2 different Proton Mail accounts, or if you set the message to be encrypted and send it to somebody else who doesn't have a Proton Mail account, you can still have perfectly encrypted communications, even if you're talking to somebody on Gmail. So as long as you're doing that, the contents of your conversation are private. Proton has no access to that and couldn't hand it over to somebody if they wanted to. And I really like the notion that Andy had about private from everybody but us. That is a very common thing today. In fact, Facebook and Google, really, that is their stance. They will tell you that they're very private products, that all of your information is private. Well, it's private from everybody but them, right? Because that's their golden goose. That's where they make their money, is off your information. You don't pay them anything, so they got to make some money somewhere. And those are both advertising companies. They make money off of selling you advertisements and making your data available to somebody else. I mean, they'll tell you, left and right that we don't sell your data. Well, no, that's because that's the important stuff. That's their intellectual property as far as they're concerned. That's their product. And so they sell access to that data, and they make billions and billions of dollars doing that. Whereas companies like Proton make their money because you pay them. Now, they do have a free tier, but their business model is built around the for-pay tiers. That's how they make their money. They don't need to make money off your data. So since this interview aired, and we just missed the timing of this, since this has aired, Proton has partnered with Simple Login. We've mentioned that before, and Henry from Techlore mentioned it in our interview. It's one of many ways today to do email aliasing, which is to create kind of dummy email addresses that you can give out, and you can generate these on the fly, as many as you want, and hand these out as your email addresses so that nobody has your real email address. And it will forward to whatever email address you want it to forward to, so you'll still get the email message. And if you reply, I believe Simple Login has this solved, because most of the other ones now do too. If you reply, it still hides your real email address. It's a forwarding service. And the beauty of that system is that if somebody starts abusing your email address, then you can just shut it off. You could just turn that alias off and stop getting junk from them and anybody they may have given that email address to. The other beauty of having aliases is it kind of fractures your personality. Most people probably have one, maybe two email addresses that they use for everything, maybe three, maybe a personal one, a public one, and a work one. That at the most, that's probably what most people have. And so most websites have you sign up using your email address, right? And that's on purpose. That not only is that guaranteed to be a unique identifier, so it's handy in that sense. You don't have to pick some weird user ID like you used to in the old days, like really cool guy 35, or probably more like real cool guy 3005, because someone's used that many, many times before. So they had a problem, they want unique usernames, and someone came up with the bright idea, well, why don't we have that username be their email address? That's guaranteed to be globally unique. Oh, and now we have their email address if we want to send them a bunch of crap or, sell that on to somebody else. So you can now, with a service like Simple Login, and I guess now Proton Mail, you will be able to create these dummy alias addresses on the fly and give those out, and they'll all come back to your one email address. You only really need to have the one account, but you can hide your true identity. And better yet, they will not be able to correlate that identity across different services. So anyway, Simple Login is a great service. There are other ways to get that same kind of feature too. DuckDuckGo has something like that. Fastmail has something like that. Apple has something like that. I'm really glad to see many people offering similar services. But they have partnered with Simple Login. And so expect to see that in Proton Mail soon, I would think. All right, so now to the part I'm sure you're waiting for. Again, as part of the promotion I just recently did, I gathered several coupon codes from some services that I truly enjoy and like to promote. Not because I get any money or anything from these guys, but because I believe in these products. And one of them was Proton Mail. And we didn't quite get this together in time for that promotion, but that means that I still have these codes to give out. And so I've got 10 codes that will upgrade you to a Proton Plus account. And so, again, I don't want to make this sound like an infomercial. I don't do infomercials. But I do think you should give this a try. And I do want you to support companies like Proton. They are doing really good work. They've got a great product. And we want companies like this to survive. We want the market to support companies that are doing things like Proton is doing. So I encourage you, regardless of whether you want the code or not, to give them a try. They've got a great free trial version of Proton Mail, and that free tier is perfectly usable, and it will give you an idea of whether or not you're going to like the service, and it kind of locks in your name. You got to, you register your Proton Mail user ID, and of course, there's a link in the show notes. But if you just go to protonmail.com, you'll find it there. So, if nothing else, sign up for a free account. Just give it a try. But as an added incentive for you to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give away 10 free upgrades from that account to the Plus account, which is normally, I think, €5 per year, but it's quite reasonable. I've been a paying Proton Mail customer for years. So sign up for a free account and send me an email from your new account, and send that email to proton@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. And send it to me by midnight, or let's say 11:59 p.m., because it's always confusing which day midnight belongs to. 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, May 6th. That gives you just a little over 2 weeks, and I will randomly choose 10 people from the whoever contacts me at proton@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. And again, send it from your new Proton Mail account. I will pick 10 of you and send out a free code, and you'll get a free year of the Plus service. All right, that's going to do it for our show today, folks. I got many great interviews already in the can. I've got 4 other ones just waiting to come out, and I've got another one in the book. So I've been flush with interviews lately. It's a good problem to have. But coming up soon, we're going to have one from David Reese from Malwarebytes. It's always fun to talk to David Reese. We're going to talk about stalkerware. And not too far in the future, we're going to have an interview with Seth, known from Seth for Privacy. And he's a big cryptocurrency guy. And I've been dying to get somebody to come on the show to explain Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general. We talked about it some years ago, but there's a lot has happened since then. So it was really good to get an update on that. And so expect that in the not too distant future as well. And several other great interviews. Sometime in May, I'm probably going to do another promotion, probably for new patrons, including challenge coins. And if you have not seen my super cool security enhancing challenge coin yet, you might want to go to d20key.com. That's the letter D, the number 20, and the word key, d20key.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. And check out the coins there. They are little challenge coins, but they have random numbers on the edges, and a little nub on the bottom side, so you can actually spin it like a top and use it to randomly choose numbers between 1 and 20, like a D20 die in Dungeons & Dragons, if you're familiar with that. But with the website, you can use that to generate random passphrases. So anyway, it's a really cool challenge coin. I've given them away in the past. It's been a little while. So we're going to give some of those away with a new Patreon promotion coming up in probably May. I'm going to have some new benefits also for the top tier. I've got some great ideas in the works there. So definitely want to check that out when it comes out. And I'll probably be announcing that in just a couple of weeks. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a great review if you get a chance. I would much appreciate that. Try out Proton Mail and shoot me an email, and maybe you'll get a year for free of the Plus account. Take care, everybody, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.